Hey, thank you for that. That was a very polite and respectful quiet that just descended on the room. Thank you. Thanks. My name's Adam Davis. On behalf of Oregon Humanities, first I want to say thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to folks in La Grande that are watching online, and thanks to people watching online wherever you may be. Before we do anything else, I just want to say a big thank you and welcome to Carina Miller, Alexandra Baretich, and Matt McCaw. Thank you for joining us for this conversation tonight. Yeah. So a little orientation to what we're doing here. This is a series of conversations called Consider This. And the series theme this year has been people, place, and power. This is the 5th event. We started thinking, the first one was about Black political power in Oregon. The most recent event was with Monica Guzman talking about understanding people coming from perspectives other than your own. Tonight we're going to be talking about borders, different kinds of borders, how we think about borders. And we're just really looking forward to the perspectives that the three of you bring and to a conversation based both on what you do for your sort of work stuff and your experiences as you've encountered, thought about, and lived in different sorts of borders. The order of the evening, we're going to talk for a little bit under an hour. We're going to invite questions at a mic that you'll see later over there for about half an hour. And then we hope you'll stay and talk to each other and to Matt, Alexander, and Carina once it's over informally. So that's the shape of things. I want to say a couple thanks, and then I want to ask you a couple questions to help these three get a sense of the room, and then we're going to jump in. The thanks are pretty brief, but I want to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Oregon Cultural Trust, the Susan Hammer Fund at the Oregon Community Foundation, and the City of Portland's We Are Better Together program for helping make this and other events possible. So thank you for that. Questions I want to ask you. First, if this is your first Oregon Humanities, Consider This, could you make a little bit of noise? Okay. I'm not sure what that sound was, but it was nice. Thank you. If you've been to one of these before, could you make a little noise? Okay. Well, thank you for coming back. If you can think of one border that has been significant for you in some way, could you make a little noise? A little mixed response to that one. This one will be even more mixed, maybe. If you have in your head a clear sense of one border whose rationale you fully understand and agree with, could you make a little noise? Okay, so there are questions maybe about borders in the room. I want to tell you as we get ready to start that, again, the organization I'm with that's putting this event on is called Oregon Humanities. And usually we have difficulty with the second word, humanities. Nobody knows what it means. We ourselves disagree about what it means, and it's not always clear how our work is related to that word. I think tonight we're going to be thinking a lot about the first word in our name, deliberately thinking about Oregon and sort of what that means and why it means what it means as a way of thinking about borders and the shapes of places and the meaning of places. And maybe that's a way to move into starting, and at least for this first one, I've asked that we go conversational as soon as we can, but at first I'm just going to ask to start with Carina and then move down to Alexander and Matt and ask for, at least in the beginning, sort of brief response. And the first question I want to ask is actually not explicitly about a border, but it's about a community that you feel like you belong to, a community that's really yours, one community, and maybe one way, one edge, something that defines it and sets it off from other communities.
Gwathanoa Shaikh chi aya hikuiau, Gwathanoa Shaikh in Minaimuma ku imilau tiwama, Inknashwaneksha Carina Miller. My name is Carina, and I'm very thankful to be here on this beautiful day with you all my new friends on this beautiful day. I really guess that the community I come from is the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. I grew up on the reservation. I live there now. But I also really come from a lot of different communities for the sake of representation, for the sake of being against Indigenous erasure. I think one of the biggest reasons I'm here is the role I fill is as the chair of the Columbia Gorge Commission. So even though our tribe was removed from that area and relocated to the reservation several hours away, we were able to still have that presence and have that connection and do work in this area. So I really come from, the Pacific Northwest. Our tribe ceded 10 million acres to the United States government when we signed our treaties, and we're put onto our 1,000-acre reservation. So I'm really here as a part of the Gorge Commission community, as a part of the Warm Springs community, as a part of a Pacific Northwest community, but I'm also here just as an Indigenous mother. We are going to talk about political borders, we're going to talk about literal borders, we're going to talk about environmental borders, but I'd also love to talk about personal borders and spiritual borders. And, yeah.
Great. It's all out there now. Thank you. Alexander, one community you feel yourself to be a part of and maybe an edge to that.
Right. I would say, first of all, the biotic community, the living space that I grew up in, which is, the forest or streams that go into the rivers and stuff. That's the first communities. Then there's the communities of, I grew up in Portland, but Portland's been changing. It has many communities in it, and so mostly just a community of friends, community of family, extended family, and then the academic community that not so much involved with as much, and that's basically my communities.
But starting with biotic and then moving to certain
Exactly.
Okay,
Exactly.
great.
Being in the forest at night and talking to owls is my community. So.
Okay, great. Matt.
Yeah, I'm Matt McCaw. I'm the spokesperson for Greater Idaho. Probably the community that's most important to me is my church community, and that is kind of globally as believers in Jesus Christ, and then smaller, you get into kind of our denominational. I go to Calvary Chapel in Prineville that we love, and then even smaller than that is that specific body of believers that meet and live life together and just support, encourage one another.
So this is already like a very wide range of communities we're talking about, which is great. I think that's one of the goals, is to be thinking about where it is, what the range of where we feel belonging, where we feel connected. And it seems like part of everything that's been named includes where the borders to those might be. And we'll probably move back to what you said a little bit about the different kinds of borders. I guess I want to ask, since you all have thought about whether it's in the Gorge or Cascadia or Greater Idaho or Warm Springs, you've all thought about borders, and maybe I can try to root that very much in your daily life and ask, what's one way that you think a key border shows up in your daily life for any of you? Just how does it show up as you go about your regular day, a particular border or another? And here you should just start. It should become a free-for-all.
Well, I'll start with political borders because that's something that does affect us in our day-to-day life. So I live in Crook County, which is right in the middle of the state, and I live about 5 minutes outside of Deschutes County. So we moved specifically to Crook County for various reasons, and Crook County is very different than Deschutes County. Even though we're bordering counties, we're both in Central Oregon. It's very different between Deschutes County and Crook County, and in just one practical way that you see that is things like if you're building or if you're trying to develop land in a place like Crook County, the regulations are much less. It's easier to get these things done than in a place like Deschutes County. We're adding on to our house right now to create a space. I have 8 children, so we built a big house, and then we realized there was no place for the kids to hang out if out of our hair. So we're adding on to our house, and just that process. You deal with government every day in your life in some capacity, and especially when you're doing something like a building project, you bump into government a lot, and that border makes a huge difference whether you're trying to build that addition in Crook County versus another county.
So political border as it shows up at home.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I really don't have an answer, except for maybe an economic borders, in the sense of the class structure that's just happening in this country all the time, with poverty. I mean, next to my apartment, which is low income, is a lot of homeless camps. And then, you'll get, for me, I ride the bus, and you'll see layers of that going through the city of Portland. So maybe the economic borders would be...
On a daily basis, you're feeling that, you're seeing it.
all the time.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
I probably next time I talk, I'm going to take out my phone and set it right here so I can keep track of the time. Otherwise, I will spend the entire hour talking. So
I'll try to help you too.
I think, in thinking about this, when I initially we talked about this panel, I did think literally, and I thought a lot about things like the reservation border. I thought about things like our ceded territories. I thought about things like where we know that the specific Wasco tribe was, or where different bands of the Warm Springs tribe were in that sort of literal boundaries. But I think as this event got closer and closer, I thought more about my own personal boundaries. I think when I'm asked, how do I show up? What role are you showing up? Are you showing up as a board member for this child care organization? Are you showing up as a water board member for the tribe? Are you showing up as a tribal rep? There's all these different hats I have to wear, but at the end of the day, I always come as an Indigenous mother. And so I think, we can't just talk about the political borders. We can't just talk about the way that voting happens. We always have to go back and look at how all these things were formed. And the reality is that Oregon was an extremely white supremacist state in the way that it was formed, and a lot of the policy that it originally started out with. And, I wanted to start out with the doctrine of discovery and kind of the dehumanization of all non-religious people, Indigenous people, how that came into land law, how that went into McClintock versus Johnson and really justified taking away human rights and giving more value to economic and land rights and those sort of things. And so basically at the end of the day, I could outline for you all of these moments in my lifetime where I've had to learn extremely harmful black and white federal and state policy that dehumanize us, that is intent on getting rid of Indigenous people, that when you really study it, there was clearly no intent for us to live into this century. And now you see that in the way policy all works out. But at the end of the day, we can look at vote numbers, we can look at county lines, we can look at the things that are being supported, but are we looking at why communities of color are disenfranchised? Are we looking at exclusion laws? Are we looking at sundown laws? Are we looking at what Oregon really did to make it such a white state? And are we taking accountability for that in the ways that it played out today? So I think the biggest boundary that affects me every day is that personal boundary, that I have to learn all of this history that hurts. And not only does it hurt to learn it, but it hurts to really understand how extremely effective a lot of it was. And not just its intent to erase us, but its intent to not tell that full story. The fact that I have to fight for things like ethnic studies to really outline the actual law and policy that created these cities and towns and remove people of color from this state, that I have to fight for that kind of curriculum to be allowed in our school, that I have to live in counties where people feel disenfranchised and not represented, but absolutely refuse to acknowledge the black and white history that my people have faced. And sometimes it's not even acknowledgement, it's just that it slips through the cracks and nobody really cares, unless it's coming from people of privilege. And so I would say the boundary that affects me the most is the personal one, that I have to allow to be crossed over and over and over, because I have to participate in these conversations and I have to represent, and I have to keep hurting my heart to learn and to be able to prove myself and to be able to argue and to validate, because there are reasons we're disenfranchised and don't vote and leave. See, I need a timer.
You're good. You're good. Thank you. And you just said a lot, but I kind of want to go back to you and then maybe move back. And I want to go back to you because of the work with the commission in the Gorge, because it is across 2 states and across 6 counties, but it's sort of on top of the states and the counties. And so just as we think about whether, like it seems to be saying borders where they are, but let's think about this other way of considering this shape superimposed on top. And I guess I just want to ask, and maybe it makes sense to connect the comment you just made to this, maybe not. How do you think about, for example, Oregon and Washington when you're doing that work? Do those states show up for you as you're doing the work in the gorge, or is it primarily about other considerations?
All right, 7:21. So the thing about the Gorge Commission, it's very policy heavy, and so I think obviously, I'm not sure how familiar people are, but it was created with the National Scenic Area, so that's really the act that gives it the authority. So it was a federal commission, but it's funded and appointed by both Oregon and Washington, and so our budget is broken up between the two states. And so really, what we do is we manage the National Scenic Area and the gorge using a management plan, and the real intent is to protect the National Scenic Area, but also support economic development in the 13 communities along the river. So the way I initially approached it was as a tribal rep when I was a tribal council member for Warm Springs, and it was really, for me, at first about community. You know, I had to come in and I had to spend time and I had to understand what the 13 communities were, what were their issues. It looked different across the board, the way planning departments worked, all that sort of thing. So first, the borders for me were more local than they were state, and then once I, started on the executive committee and became an officer and these sort of things, and you care about the budget. And so then you do look more at the legislature in Oregon and Washington. How do we fund it? What are we really doing with this money? That sort of thing. So I think, it always comes back down to community borders more so for me and trying to understand that 50-foot level. But obviously, when you get up to the litigation that the commission's been tied into, we did do a revision of the management plan during the Trump administration where we were able to get in language about climate change and about diversity and equity, which was a big deal for a federal commission at that time. Then you're worried about the federal and the state level, but for the most part, you're trying to listen to economic development concerns, how tourism's impacting people on them local.
So it's interesting to think, okay, these 13 local communities, and then really around regulations and very specific policy decisions. And now, Alexander, maybe I'll move to you because Cascadia feels like, in a way, it's more on the level of an idea.
Well, yes and no. I mean, it's a physical thing. I mean, you can't really touch Oregon and Washington or Idaho. I mean, those are political, abstract, let me say it this way, they're legal fiction. Whereas the bioregion is something you can touch. But, where does the bioregion begin? Where does it end? Where does a mountain begin? Where does it end? Is it the glacier? Is it the forest? Is it the rocks? It's a combination of all of that. And in the case of Cascadia, it is, it's this water, and it's flowing through the mountains and back. So, when somebody will ask me, define Cascadia, most of us default to, okay, it's Oregon, Washington, British Columbia. It's two different countries coming together. But it's horrible to say that because those are colonial lines. Those are lines imposed by a people that came to this area, conquered it, settled it, whatever you want, took it over and claimed it as theirs. When it's like, no, we need to remove these lines. We need to look at that flow of water again. I keep going back to water, but everything's about water.
So that a satisfying understanding of Cascadia would be, how would you say it? What the idea of Cascadia is in a way that...
Cascadia is a living space. It's a life space. That's what bioregion means, a life place. So it's a living space. And the whole planet's covered in living space. It's a biosphere. It's a life circle, so to speak, globe.
All right.
Well, I think something that you mentioned is very pertinent to our discussion that we have about Greater Idaho, and that's that these lines were placed in a specific spot a very long time ago by people that lived a very long time ago. So in the case of Oregon and Idaho, that border between the two states was placed there 164 years ago. And when that border was put there, there was less than 50,000 people lived in the entire state of Oregon. So it was a very different time and a very different place, and that border was placed there for a reason. And I honestly don't even know why that was why they chose that spot. But that spot is not functional anymore, and it does not make people's lives better. It does not group similar peoples. It does not actually represent the cultural divide that is in our state. And the cultural divide in the state of Oregon is really the west side of the state and the east side of the state. West side is more urban. Politically, it votes differently. It's got a different geography, different climate. The east side is rural, more conservative, dry. People make their living differently. Those two groups of people are kind of pushed together into the same state governance because of where a line was arbitrarily put 164 years ago, and it causes tension that we don't need to have. It doesn't need to be there, and we can do away with that tension if we move the line.
Okay, so some good shifting in seats over here closer to me. It's interesting to think about. I think, in a way, Carina, a few minutes ago, you were talking about, I think, a lot of divides. In a way, the daily experience of a number of divides. And Matt, I hear you talking really about as if there's one big divide between two groups. And it feels to me like one of the questions that I hope we're going to go more into is, like, what should we hope for from geographical borders? What should drive them, or what should we simply say, okay, those are there, we can work in different ways? In other words, what makes, I think, again, to say, like, what should drive the reconsideration of a border? Like, if we're talking about the Gorge Commission, for example, that seems to be driven, well, let me just ask you, what drives the shape of that as you understand it?
Well, I mean, so I think more so, I mean, the Gorge Commission is only a piece of a lot of what I do. And so I think, I did run for the state Senate in 2020 out in Senate District 30, which was the biggest district before redistricting, and it covered a lot of Eastern Oregon. And so we actually did a tour out into the district where I went into a lot of towns where I was a Democratic nominee, and maybe the numbers weren't really on my side, but so I think really what I found was people are, disempowered, and people are broke down, and, as far as the socioeconomics of our communities, the lack of resources across the board, it didn't necessarily matter if we were Democrats or Republican, that people are being negatively impacted by a lot of the policy that this state has led. I mean, let's be honest, Oregon is really about economic development. When you really cut it down to it, we really extract our natural resources for things like timber. We make exemptions for corporations. We do all these sort of things for the bottom line to be the rights of corporations and economies. And so as someone who's a former tribal rep, this system was built for white men to have businesses, not for indigenous people to live. And so when you really look at how, I didn't learn about things like sundown laws until after I was in college, and it was from other people. There's not these sort of things that are put in curriculum that really show why people of color were pushed out. And so until we're able to have these conversations and really dive in and be accountable to the history of this state and the reality of how this state came to be, we're never going to be able to get through those divides where we're able to talk about economic development, where we're able to talk about, mental health services and treatment for addiction and access to these sort of things out in Eastern Oregon, because there are so many things that it is different on one side of the mountain and the other. Politics are different. The way we live is different. I hunt. I have a lot of these tendencies that don't necessarily align with the city, but I also want to talk about racism. And I shouldn't be forced into, having representatives who would never look like me, who never prioritize me, but knowing that their family is just as broke as my family. And so economics is something we can meet on, that my dad was a logger, and a lot of these families are loggers, so I always have to find this common ground. I really think I would like to say that, I wish that we could carve out communities where everyone can be represented and feel included and, have their values, be all aligned, but that's not what's going to happen. And I think what really in Oregon we need to do is, look at those bigger 5,000-foot issues of resources of what are we doing? Are we supporting the expansion of education? Are we supporting these sort of things? And I don't know how boundaries other than within the state can really be changed to reflect those things. I don't think they can. I think it has to be inner work as communities and inner work as a state, and just meet us where we're all at.
Mm-hmm. Alexander, you look like you were you going to respond to Carina there?
No, except for I was thinking about, the divide between East and West. And if you applied that to the building I live in, because I do not agree with most of my neighbors, at all. I mean, some of my neighbors, one of them has a Merkley sign on her door, but no, I don't agree with them. Imagine if you took that building and divided it up. Said, okay, you guys have to live on the west side and you guys have to live on the east side. It's like, that'd be stupid. So, sorry.
No.
Yeah, I mean, and even though we don't work together, except for, we do have some things together, it's that diversity of thought that actually creates dialogue, that creates solutions in some ways. If we all thought in a monolithic thought, that would be nice, great. Maybe we'd all agree that we should have a bigger community garden. But having that diversity of thought might say, well, why don't we have a Zen Buddhist style garden or something like that? Why don't we do something different? Let's make a rec room or something like that. It's the diversity of thought that really counts on that part.
I see diversity of thought about to happen. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So historically, borders have been used to group similar communities together, to similar people, similar cultures, so that those communities can govern themselves and preserve their culture and make their community better by deciding what rules that community is going to live their life under. So, when we talk about borders, what we're talking about is grouping similar peoples together. And we do that a lot in this country. We go to a lot of effort to get people representation, get people political power so that they have representation. And, with the Greater Idaho movement, what we're trying to do is we have this issue in Oregon where the west side of the state has 90% of the population, and the east side of the state has a tenth of the population. And so because those two cultures are very different, whatever the west side of the state decides they want politically, they get, because they have the numbers to outvote the east side of the state. So we have a permanent political minority on the east side of the state.
Although I will just interrupt for a second to say that, if we look at Salem right now, we don't see either side getting what it wants. We see a strange form of dialogue and non-dialogue.
Well, what you're seeing is these two very different cultures that are clashing. You have, the east side of the state or conservative people in Oregon in general typically do not have a lot of political power, and they don't have a lot of ability to make political change in this state, and so that's part of why the frustration exists in Eastern Oregon. Eastern Oregon is a very conservative place. It's very similarly minded. People in Eastern Oregon vote about 75% the same way on most issues. And so you have a group of people who's very similarly minded, want certain policies and certain government for their communities, but are not able to get that at the state level because we're grouped with a different group of people that has different thoughts about those things.
Although pushing it, I just want to keep this question of homogeneity and diversity, which feels like we're talking about, and you even said 75%, which may be a high measure depending if you're looking eastern or county by county, and then there's the question of, well, 25% is one of every four. Even if you took that high number, that seems significant, but what I want to put back out here is, I thought, Alexander, you were putting the question of diversity as itself.
Well, I do have something to add to that.
Great.
And that is, we have this so-called left-right divide, which is a very small spectrum in the greater political spectrum. Yeah. And, I'll tend to vote Democrat, even though I'm registered as a Green and usually nonpartisan or non-affiliated. But I didn't want Tina Kotek as governor, and yet that's what I was stuck with. And maybe we should be asking a bigger question, and that is about our political party systems, about, just to run for, I have a friend in the audience who has ran for different offices. You have to have $3,000 just to get your name in the voter pamphlet. That means somebody who's poor can't run. That means they have to have party backing, and he's in one of the third parties, and sometimes he gets the backing, sometimes he doesn't. So maybe we should be looking at our political structure itself.
Matt, can I just get Carina, because
Sure.
I think if I'm reading you right, you're about to jump in.
All right, let's look at the time. I think, so again, I grew up on a reservation. I'm enrolled Warm Springs. My parents, I wouldn't say are particularly political, but I just was. And I think There's a term that I've really come to use called societal gaslighting. And it's really, I grew up out there in Jefferson County, which is one of the most conservative counties in Oregon. You know, one of the measures, not the last local one, but the one before, to remove slavery out of Oregon, it failed. We had a couple cycles ago, we ran 5 women from Warm Springs for local offices and had an editorial come out from one of the opponents' wives about how the tribal members shouldn't be allowed to vote because we don't pay property taxes, so we shouldn't be allowed to vote in school board elections. I think, you know, it's hard to not just call things out with the terms that I know of, like, oh, we're going to group people together based on their values or based on some sort of common thing that's called segregation, and it didn't work. And so I think, you know, for me, it's really hard because I talk about this term called societal gaslighting, where I grew up from a political family who were tribal leaders, who were spiritual leaders, and I was taught from a very early age about boarding schools, about genocide, about assimilation policy, but these weren't things I was taught in school. And a matter of fact, I was taught why these things were necessary for the industrial age, why these things were necessary for the timber industry. And you know what? Those things are failing now. They're failing every community. All of these sort of ways of making a living, they're not working. And are we dealing with climate change? No. Because everything was carved out for white men of privilege to be able to have these businesses and sustain. But anything that takes it off track, we just look the other way. And so, again, having to fight for things like ethnic studies and having to go to places like Pendleton and talk to city councilors about, you know, the segregation that happened there, the removal of the Chinese immigrants, and to be told things like, well, we didn't have laws saying Chinese immigrants couldn't live here, but there were laws saying people could shoot them legally when the sun went down. So how do we navigate and how do we address these things that have carved out these situations where people like me will never be represented by my local elected officials? We'll never have a county commissioner who looks like me, who advocates for my issues, and yet that county commissioner can turn around and talk about being disenfranchised because of the bigger state politics and then walk out on us. I mean, the walkouts are the exact reason I ran for Senate in 2020, even though I was a poor single mother from the reservation, dealing with not having water, dealing with not having childcare, all these things. It's, you know, it's just so maddening to express what societal gaslighting is. The public education I got that normalized racism, everything I've had to do to just exist, the Gorge Commission, all these things, I don't want to be doing any of this, but I don't want to be erased, and I don't want my people to be erased, and I don't want the holder of the story to keep telling the story we've been telling, because we're not going to get anywhere if that's what we keep doing. So,
Thank you.
So the idea about diversity versus homogenous groups comes up a lot, and I think that, you know, people in Oregon who've lived here for any amount of time know that the East Side is different than the West Side. They're very different cultures, and you can go down almost any issue, and you pick an issue that people vote on. And people on the west side of the state tend to vote one way. They want certain things for their communities. And people on the east side tend to vote the opposite. And they want something else for their communities. Because of where our current state border is, and because it lumps these two groups of very different peoples together, and one of those groups numerically outweighs the other so much, you have Eastern Oregon counties that effectively have no say in their own state government and have policy forced on them that they don't want and that doesn't make sense for their communities. So it causes a lot of political tension. And so that's why I was talking earlier about where the border is now isn't functional, it doesn't work. It actually causes more problems than it solves. If we moved that border and allowed Eastern Oregon counties to get their state level governance from Idaho, which is the state level government they want and that they vote for every chance they get, then that political tension in Oregon goes away. The walkout that you're seeing in the legislature, that goes away because you have like-minded people in Western Oregon that create policy that makes sense for them, and you allow Eastern Oregonians to go get policy that makes sense for their communities.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine all of us, probably everybody, is having different thoughts in response to everything that gets said. One thing I'm thinking, and I wish we could do this, is I know there's a room full of people in La Grande right now that are watching this and listening to this. Mm-hmm. And I can't say for sure, but my guess is there's a range of opinions in there. And I say that to say, I think I actually get viscerally uncomfortable. I feel it sort of in me when I hear there's people on the east side are one way, people on the west side are another way. people on one side of your building or one way, people on the other side. Or it just feels to me like actually what that does, what worries me about that is it does away with what feels like the tension that you were talking about, the difficulty of that tension, but it also feels like that tension holds what our democracy, if it's going to be an inclusive democracy, kind of requires. Mm-hmm. I guess you're nodding. I'm curious what you're thinking about this, the idea of there are people like this on the east side or the west side.
Well, I mean, and again, so I've always been very progressive in just my spirit, but I think, I do come from Central Oregon, and I do come from a logging and ranching family, and I do understand. But this is the hard part, is nobody I've ever had to work with has ever had to humanize themselves. Nobody's ever had to explain themselves. Nobody's ever had to advocate on the same sort of level to just be understood. I had to go into politics and understand local government, state government, federal government, be able to do work across the board in energy, natural resources, all these things, to just even be in that room, let alone have a seat at the table, let alone sit at the head of that table. And then any, regular, mediocre white man can have the same platforms as me. And it's hard to even just exist knowing the things I know and wake up every day knowing I have kids who are going to live in this world, let alone trying to do something about it. So I think, again, going back to, obviously Indigenous people are in a huge number of the population of this state. Black people are in a huge number of population of the state. Mexican people are in a huge number. There's a reason for that. And so to not acknowledge those things and to continue, because I am from conservative Oregon, where we have had these representatives who want to go to Idaho for a long time, and they're not able to pass policy. They're not able to advocate for those issues I go back to that affect every family, like health and education and socioeconomics, but, want to stand in front of the line and be more disenfranchised in our communities. And so, and again, local representatives, state representatives, they don't have to understand tribal sovereignty. They don't have to understand tribal issues. They pick it up and put it down when they want. But I have to be able to navigate and go through all of these systems if I want to keep my place here.
Can I have us? I want to have us step out for just 1 second. I want to ask this is a feeling question. So when you hear the word Oregon, what do you feel? And maybe why? Alexander.
Well, I mean, Oregon was once a lot bigger than
You
what
go
it
a
is.
little closer, thanks.
Oregon was once a lot bigger than it is now, over 100, 200 years ago, as a political construct or territorial construct. So when I think of Oregon today, I think of just a screwed up system, to be honest. I mean, again, the last election, where you had somebody who doesn't want to pay his taxes throwing lots of money on one political branch or one political party, and then you have a political party that is in office who has lots of money to throw at their candidate. And what do I think of when I think of Oregon? I think
What do you
Oregon
feel?
itself.
I want to ask what you feel. I'm asking
What
because
do
I
I
think you're
feel
talking a lot
about
about
Oregon?
feeling.
I mean, I have a romantic image of Tom McCaw trying to fight for the land use laws and stuff like that, but at the same time, I see it as a failure. It was a failure almost right after it was established. I mean, that whole 1970s hippie, leftist, progressive Republican worldview that we were trying to push, which was, open beaches and stuff like that, has been really a failure because it was undermined immediately by the timber industry and stuff. So
Okay.
Oregon, to me, is really kind of sad.
Okay.
So I hate to say that. I hate to say that feeling about it, but it is.
It's interesting that you both feel it and you say you hate to say that.
Yeah, because I hate to say it because I grew up here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Karina, can I ask you? You want to go to Matt? Yeah.
Well, I have similar feelings to Alexander. I also grew up here. I was born in Oregon. I've lived 45 of my 47 years of my life. I've lived in Oregon. It feels like home to me. I have a nostalgia for the Oregon that I grew up in. It's a beautiful state, and it's a diverse state, and it's it's got this independent spirit and this problem-solving, in innovative ways, not afraid to think outside the box, and that's the part of Oregon that I love and that have this nostalgia for. Over the last couple decades, though, that's changed, and Oregon has become much more kind of progressive and left leaning, and it is changing, and I think the way we feel about Oregon, or even just the perception of Oregon from other people, is different than what it was 35 years ago when I was growing up.
It's interesting. It sounds like a shared feeling for somewhat different reasons, but a similar feeling.
I would say it definitely feels like shuffling a deck of cards, and every card is something different. And I feel the anger I feel when I go to the legislature and have to deal with Republicans and Democrats. I feel the way it feels in spring when you're digging roots when my great-grandma was here. Mm-hmm. I feel what it feels like when the Columbia is splashing you when you get too close. I feel all of the beautiful things and the painful things. And I think maybe sometimes we say the things that we don't like about Oregon because we do love it, and we do love the ideas that it could be. I mean, one of the cards in that deck is that I do feel like Oregon being progressive, she flies with her own wings, that there was a huge opportunity on the table for carbon markets and ethnic studies curriculum for Oregon to really be a catalyst for those things as those things were being created globally. And so there's opportunities here in the way that our state is broken up by labor and natural resources and progressive values, and the way we can move and navigate if, Democrats could push more statewide and maybe open up non-affiliated voters to everyone. But there's things we can do to be more inclusive to all Oregonians and to start making that path, from where I live to the city of values and economic development, and really just being realistic with our forestry practices, all these sort of things. So all of it, all flipping in a deck.
Okay, at least 52 feelings.
Yeah.
That one's, I think I want to push back from that to something, Alexandra, that I read in an interview of yours from, I want to say, at least a few, maybe several years ago, and it was around it was when you were developing the Doug flag.
Yeah, the Cascadian flag. Yeah.
The Cascadian flag to really help people conceive of what the idea of Cascadia is.
Right.
And it seemed like what you were trying to do was change consciousness.
Yes, 100%. Yes.
I love that you just said yes, 100% yes to changing consciousness. So is there any part of that would, because I'm thinking about Matt sitting right next to you, who's trying to change the literal border through legislation that 2 states and the federal government would have to vote on. Did Cascadia ever carry, or does it carry, that kind of aspiration?
Repeat that
The
one.
aspiration to change the political borders to align with the change of consciousness you're seeking around it.
I think once you get into that consciousness that you are interconnected with everything around you, with the forest and stuff like that, those political borders dissolve. They really, literally dissolve. It's like, what's the point of having a political border? Because the birds, the moss doesn't care. It's really about, again, going back to water. It's that flow of energy that really is the most. I know that sounds very hippie-ish, but in some ways it is hippie-ish. I mean, as horrible as that term is, but I mean, it's a deep mysticism about it, about the land.
Which then, I mean, what I hear you saying is, why even change the political borders? Yeah. It's more that the political borders recede in importance.
Exactly. They dissolve. Because you're one with Mother Earth, and that's everything. If you're not one with Mother Earth, then you're really basically a colonialist. You're consuming.
Okay.
I mean, even though by nature we eat, but in this case, you are a cancer on the planet. You're sucking everything away. So that flag is to create this consciousness that we are one with this planet. And it's not just that flag. I mean, I've created other bioregional flags as well. And my goal was to get people to be, wherever you're living, be conscious of your space. So,
I actually think that's an interesting way of looking at things, Alexander. our geography does affect us. It affects the way we make our living. It affects how we live our lives. And in Oregon, there is two very distinct geographies. The west side of the Cascades is a different geography, a different climate than the east side of the Cascades. And so, to understand that is by itself going to create different groups of people and different people that see things differently is an interesting thought, because that is certainly part of it. Part of the reason why people in Eastern Oregon identify with Idaho and the politics of Idaho and the values of Idaho is because Eastern Oregon counties look like Idaho. If you look at the satellite map, which you said you had rolling, it looks like Idaho. If you were drawing borders today, you would not put the border on the Snake River where it currently is. You would probably try to group the similar geography, similar peoples in the Willamette Valley, and then group the Eastern Oregon high desert climate folks with other high desert climate.
What's the question?
Well, I think I think Matt was responding to Alexander talking about geography as a way to think about borders. Is
I
what
think,
I heard.
well, I mean, obviously, before Oregon was even a state, tribal people were more in line with the Cascadia region and really following water flows in the environment and things like that, and settling in places that were more common sense and were economically beneficial. The Warm Springs people were placed on a reservation because it wasn't farmable land. It was rocky and forest, and so we were actually intentionally placed there because during that time, with all the land allotments and all these sort of things happening, there wasn't a lot of value. But fortunately for us, there was value in the timber. And so I think, looking at the way, or understanding a tiny bit about bioregions that I do, I look at the restoration projects that the tribe has done. And so initially, a lot of the streams and those sort of things were just straight cut for logs to be able to go down them for the logging companies and that sort of thing. But on the time I got to spend on council, we participated in a lot of land management things where we actually put streams back to their original flows because it was better across the board for the riparian zones, for the habitats, for the species, all those sort of things. So it's interesting to me, again, to say that I feel like, Oregon, we got to be realistic, that our policy was really about economic development and extraction of natural resources, not protection of it. And we show that in how we have literally recarved the landscape to serve our economic values. But now, when you talk about all these borders, you have your irrigation districts, you have your water issues. Are we really answering to actually the water and the flow of nature? No, we're answering to economics. Once again, how much water can we give to farmers? How much can we put into these reservoirs? How much can the earth possibly handle that we push to its breaking point? Is that really what Oregon's about? I don't think that's what we want it to be about, but that's what it has become, And so it's hard because it is the way it is now. And as a tribe who have senior water rights, we have to work with our irrigation district all the time, and there just isn't the water. So what is the answer? I wish it could be that political boundaries dissolve and we actually use all our funding to just deal with the real solutions, but, politics.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't think they're just going to dissolve either. I mean, it is hopeful thinking, but we live in a time of, this is a very anthropocentric time. We are human-centered, and we can't, but this is why I designed the flag, was to create that consciousness so we can help dissolve it. Now, maybe if everybody started taking mushrooms, I haven't taken mushrooms myself, but maybe that dissolving of ego would help. But right now we're not doing it, because as we get more scared, we go more into ego. I mean, this is not to get into psychology and stuff, but as we get more scared, we get into group identity, nationalism. I hate to say it, states, my area versus your area, and it's not going to help anything. It's going to make it worse, unfortunately, because we're not really dealing with the big issue, which is climate change, which is everything.
So it's interesting how in a very short span of time we've talked about, a little bit about possibly moving one state border and dissolving political borders altogether, and you used the phrase, we've got to be realistic.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think, and it makes me want to actually ask each of you, like when you think, like, I want to be as realistic as I can about what we can hope for, I guess I want to ask, like, why, to what extent does it make sense to think about changing a border? To what extent is it more, what can we do within the borders as they are?
I mean, for me, it's always a question of what are we going to do within the borders. And I think it's really important to express for me that I was born with a boot on my neck. And it's several different people's boots, but it's always filled with colonization and kind of the systems it left. And so, you know, it's hard because our tribal values, I'm going to try and, you know, not ramble too hard, but I'm trying to use our water issue specifically as something to show why we have to be realistic. You know, water, which we call chush, is still the most sacred thing in our actual religion. Our longhouses, when we do things, we end and we start with it. It's the center of all life. It's the most sacred thing. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the water issues, but basically we haven't had a safe, drinkable water system for at least a decade, but we've known about it for about 7 years now. And there are reasons we can't have access to the state funds, one of those being we don't have meters, and the other one being we don't tax our people for the water. And so this is something policy-wise that the state could have made these changes in policy in the last 7 years, but they haven't. What they've said is the tribe has to meter these houses and tax that water in order to qualify for these. But when we were on council, we would fight with our elders because basically to them, when we signed our treaties, when we were relocated, there was these solid things that would redefine us as human beings, as Indian people, if we were to kind of change who we were. And charging our people for chush, charging our people to literally just have access to water is one of those things. So on one side, you had a handful of us younger ones who understood the reality that our people were going to go without clean water for years if we didn't just put a $5 flat fee that we weren't going to enforce. But our elders understood that that meant the last pieces of our soul we've been able to maintain with that boot on our neck all of these decades. So we never did it. And to this day, we still have breaks. We still have to deal with our water situation and have to go get our water from places and boil it and do all these sort of things. We still have an over $200 million need for the water system. We're still trying to deal with these things. So this is a perfect example of us maintaining really strong tribal values, but coming up against the reality. So what do we do? What do we do? Do we charge our people or do we wait for the state to bend? You know, because that boot is going to be on our neck from every angle, from the peer, from our local reps, from our state reps, from our federal reps. We're on our own. So I don't know what what the answers are, but there's the problem.
And what you said at the start was that you want the focus to be very much on how within the existing arrangement do we make the change rather than Alexander.
For me, changing borders is like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. It's like, okay, great, we rearranged the chairs to be in a different order, but we're still headed towards the iceberg. So we need to start really questioning deeper issues. And again, I would say with Oregon, the east versus west divide, maybe you should be looking at the political structure that we have in the first place. Does it represent everybody? Is there an issue of money as being the big problem with the system? And you know, this inequity within that money system. So yeah, I'm not in favor of rearranging deck chairs.
So deck chairs back your way. I mean, I think we know your answer more clearly on this.
I think they could use some rearranging. I think borders are imaginary lines that are a tool to make people's lives better, and they should be serving people. We shouldn't be causing problems and causing political tension because of where an imaginary line was placed 164 years ago. We should use that as a tool to group similar peoples, get people matched to government and policy that they want, and that makes sense for their communities, and lower political tension. So realistically, I got involved with the Greater Idaho movement because as a lifelong Oregonian, I know the urban-rural divide. I know the political tension that comes from that, and it's a solution. Moving the border would be a solution that would do away with that urban-rural divide and that political tension and make people's lives better.
So it's interesting. I guess I'm going to move us toward questions, and as a way of doing that, I want to give you a second to think about, as you've listened to the other two people you've been up here with, whether a question is coming to mind for you, either within you or for either of the other people up here. I do want to say it's interesting, and I'm probably overstepping my role a little bit, but I guess I feel like tension is healthy and desirable. And so, especially in political contexts. And I worry if the goal is something like homogeneity or unanimity. As someone raised within the borders of a country that tries to be democratic, it's especially when we try to do away with tension that I start to get most nervous. So again, I think I'm overstepping my role, and maybe what I'm doing is trying to model the question that's most popping up for me as we move toward questions from the audience. But I want to, having said that, and I think it's a question, how confident am I about doing away with tension as a political goal? It actually makes me quite nervous, so I'm thinking a lot about that and what I hope is a useful way. Can I ask, has a question emerged for you as we've been
not a
talking?
question so much as when I've listened to Carina talk, and clearly what's happened, what happened with Native Americans was awful, and the history is long and ugly and not good. But it's an example also of where there is a strong community there. There is a community that is its own community, and it is different, and it's diverse, and it's not the same as Western Oregon. It's not the same as Eastern Oregon. You're your own community, and you deserve to have the self-determination to organize that community the best way that you can. And I've heard, when you are talking about these frustrations with the state and with the Democratic Party and with the Republican Party and all these things, it makes me think you guys need more autonomy. You need more ability to go outside of these other structures, and you know how to set up your community the best for your community. And that's essentially what we're talking about. When we're talking about moving borders and grouping similar peoples, it's that there are communities that are different from each other, and that's okay, and that's good. And they see the world differently, and they want different things for their communities, and they know best how they want to set up their communities. And we need to give them the space, the political power to set those communities up the way that makes sense for them.
Thanks, Matt. Alexander, a question that, as we've been talking for the last hour, that's in your
not so
head.
much a question, but just an observation that if you base your political borders on the current political structures, we've seen those structures shift radically. Oregon used to have two progressive Republican governors. That was Tom McCaw and Hatfield before that. And they were the ones that pushed the land use laws, which we would today count as liberal left. And yet that movement was also very much rural, not urban. Urban people didn't really want those land use laws. They liked doing, subdivisions and stuff like that. And it was the rural communities that tried to stop huge subdivisions and destruction of farmland and stuff like that. So I would caution to have anything based on a political structure, because those are very fickle things. The Democratic Party is now really the war party. They're supporting a war in Eastern Europe, whereas the Republican Party is now the peace party. I mean, it just shows you how fast this stuff shifts. And to base anything on this artificial construct is really, I think, a very dangerous thing to do for borders.
Let's go to, I want to go to Carina.
We're out of time. That
You're
one by
going
fast.
back yeah.
Well, I think, I will say, we're talking about politics. The boot on my neck, it's Democratic and Republican. And so we could have spent a whole nother hour talking about those things specifically. But I think what I will say is that, as far as the tension goes, someone recently said I should tell people when I start to talk, I'm going to punch you in the face and you're going to like it. And it's true. I think I obviously live in Central Oregon. Again, all of my representatives are Republicans. I constantly have to engage with conservative people who are racist, who say racist things, who say things that are white supremacist narratives, and I have to understand where they're coming from and why they are, have those things ingrained in them, and I have to speak to them in a way that shows them I'm intelligent and I deserve to be there and these sort of things. But also, if I'm going to sit down at a table with you and I'm going to have to do all this stuff, we're going to lock arms and we're going to talk about that racism. Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about boarding schools. We're going to talk about assimilation policy. We're going to talk about sterilization. We're going to talk about immigrant rights in ICE. We're going to talk about Black exclusionary laws and Chinese exclusionary laws, because all of those things are a part of who we are. And those of us that benefit the most from it from this state need to be the ones who really understand it. So, I think there's importance in the tension, and I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not letting anyone else go anywhere, because it's important for us to have these conversations if we want to really evolve and change. So the tension is good.
So, Matt, I know you had, and you may be holding a comment. What I want to do is I want to actually shift us to questions from people in the room. And so as we switch to that, I do want to say, following what you just said about tension, that I think there was some uncertainty about what this evening was going to be, not just from people coming, but my guess is also from the three of you. What the hell did we agree to walk into? And I want to say I appreciate that all of you have been game to engage with each other this evening. And so I feel like we need more of this, and just really grateful to all three of you for that. So with questions, I'd ask if you could introduce yourself. Let's not aim for gotcha questions. Let's aim for questions where we try to understand more. Yeah, please.
I work here.
Ben works here, yeah.
He gave me motivation to come up. If he wasn't standing here, I don't know if I would ask the question. But so my question is, generally speaking, so we talked about how, or you guys talked about how borders are fictions, and all of you acknowledged, at least to some degree, they're made up. So, but there was some reluctance, and I don't even know if I agree with Mr. Greater Idaho, but there was some reluctance on his idea of changing borders. Well, if borders are a fiction, and they don't align, at least in some ways, with current realities, when is a good reason, and this question goes to Carina, and what was your name?
Alexander.
Alexander? Perfect. When would be a good reason to change borders, and in what context?
And can you just tell us your name?
My name is Nick.
Thanks, Nick.
I'll go first. I don't know when one should change borders, because again, borders have a historical reason for being there, and borders change. They do change. And one of my professors used to study what was called reliquary borders. These are old borders that do not exist any longer, but that people still study. A perfect example is the Berlin Wall. Hadrian's Wall is another one, where they have these weird historical and cultural things where they change the culture itself. Is there a reason to change a border? A legitimate reason? I'm sure there is. I mean, it could be political alignments. It could be gerrymandering. It could be, but ultimately, when I cross into Multnomah County, into Clackamas County, and vice versa, it really doesn't really matter to me. Though once it did, when I had a police officer following me, I was like, I'm trying to get into Multnomah County before he gets in. I didn't make it. Actually, I was 3 feet into it, but.
I mean, can I just say, when I was thinking about state borders, I was trying to think about my own experience with how they became a daily reality. And for me, it was actually crossing into and out of Arkansas when I was young, long-haired, driving out-of-state plates. And Arkansas, into and out of Arkansas, became an experience of state borders that I didn't want to have again.
Yeah, yeah.
So it felt like a very visceral, a milder version of a boot, much milder, but I think there a little bit. Anything in response to Nick's question about if or when it makes sense to think about those borders?
Hi, Nick. We went to college together.
All right.
I thought he was going to ask me a gotcha question. I honestly don't think there's really a good reason to move borders at this point, just because, again, I think we need to deal with the issues as they are, just because of the way everything is set up for the way things all work. I don't necessarily think, even if you look at redistricting and the way we redistricted based on the population, it can always be different. It was a lot of focus on the Portland area and not a lot of focus on shifting districts out, politically for us in Central Oregon, that sort of thing. So I don't know. I think, to be honest, I would agree more with the dissolve of borders to really follow the water more and the environment more than I would the shifting in order for certain viewpoints to live on, Yeah.
Matt, is it okay if we go to the next question? Because I feel like you've spoken to why we should shift state borders. Yes. It looks like Ben might have a question from LeGrand.
I do. So one of the people viewing this conversation in the Grand asks, how do you see borders, arbitrary lines, as preventing the free exercise of individuals' rights to self-determination of place? It's not directed at any one of you in particular.
Will you say it one more time?
Yes. How do you see borders, which are arbitrary lines, as preventing the free exercise of individuals' rights to self-determination of place?
It's a very,
Yeah, so I'll answer that. I think that's what we're seeing in Eastern Oregon right now. Eastern Oregon is a very similarly minded area as far as the populace. They vote a certain way very consistently on multiple issues, and they never get the government that they actually are voting for at the state level, and they haven't for 30, 40 years because of where a border's at. And so essentially, these 15 Eastern Oregon counties have no self-determination to set up the state government that they actually want because they're grouped with the more populous west side of the state. So that's a situation. We are in a situation in Oregon where the placement of a border is keeping people from having the government that they actually want and that they think would be best for their communities.
At the state level.
At the state level, yes. Yep.
Either of you have any response to the question from LeGrand that came in?
Do you have a response?
not a little bit, but yeah, I'll throw in something. I was just reminded of the removal of borders. Again, I do believe in the removal of borders, but from a neoliberal, which is an economic structure about globalism, they would like to have borders removed for economic reasons, but at the same time, borders up to keep you or me out of a certain area. And it's just interesting that the question just brought that back up to me.
Okay.
That it's one of the things I am actually fighting against is neoliberalism, which is this idea of just transferring things from one place to another while destroying economies and stuff.
I'm going to go back to societal gaslighting, because I think an example of this is a reservation boundary. That a lot of tribes were put on the reservation to kind of cut off our connection to our former lifeways and to colonize us. We literally have, the building, the commissary where they gave out grain and gave out agricultural tools and sent us to the boarding school to teach us the gender roles and teach us our economic benefit and all these sort of stuff. And originally, the BIA wanted it so that we had to get permission to even leave the reservation, and this cut us off from the rivers, from the way we moved the seasons, from the way we did everything. And so that actually is an example of a boundary that was created to literally cut us off from our self-determination. And that, when I say societal gaslighting, it is maddening that we can't learn that actual history. Our boarding schools still stand. We still have boarding schools in Oregon, Chemawa, places like that are still running, taking Indian kids today. And so to live in a place where we don't have curriculum that teaches those things that are still greatly impacted, but are going to form a movement because other people aren't feeling like they have a voice in the state, while completely disregarding this reality and how effective it's been towards Indigenous people, that is the gaslighting part. And the societal part is because it's so ingrained in our curriculum and our education, and it's not saying that it didn't happen, it's just focusing on other people's privilege and other people's issues and laying that over these actual really effective things that happen. So a reservation border is a good example of something that took away our self-determination. But now, and then you talk about assimilation programs, and that border was used as a tool to separate us from the community and the things that we were able to maintain. So.
Just to add to that, is also used to bring tribes together who hated each other. I was thinking about the Chinook and the Quinault. And, Governor Stevens originally wanted the Chinook to move up to where the Quinault were. And the Quinault said, or the Chinook said, these people hate us. We don't want to move up here. But their goal was genocide. So, yeah.
So and thanks to the folks in LeGrand for sending in that question. Yeah, please.
My name is Jennifer Walter. I am a retired attorney and a retired public school teacher. I'd love to talk about Indian issues, particularly like the mascot issue I was very involved in, but I'm going to present something about, my big question is, how important is the truth? And let me give you a little background on this. And then I'm going to ask what's going to sound, did I say this? I'm going to sound like a gotcha question. I don't mean it that way. But I worked for the Oregon Judicial Department for 4 sessions of the legislature, and I followed every single day. I was listening to hearings and listening to the floor debate. One of the things that the Greater Idaho movement seems to be saying is that Eastern Oregonians don't have a say in what's going on at the state level. And I think that that's a false representation. And I'll give you 2 examples. When the Oregon legislature was looking at coming up with a new minimum wage, that minimum wage was zoned, and that was done for the benefit of rural communities. So I think to say that that Eastern Oregonians don't have the ability to influence what is going on in Salem is inaccurate. And then the other thing was, I was the marijuana expert. So when the referendum was passed, I listened to every single word about what was happening with the marijuana movement. And that was something where there was a county and city option that was done for the benefit of rural communities. So I have trouble being able to listen to what you are saying, your organization is saying, because I think you're making a false representation. So I wanted to give you the opportunity to consider that and to respond to it. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and thank you for bringing that up, because you highlight something that's really important about our movement. And you mentioned 2 areas, and it hasn't happened very often, but those are the 2 examples actually that I use. So there are times when rural Oregonians' concerns are addressed, and there's special, not carve out, but there's special provisions put into legislation to directly, because rural Oregon is different than urban Oregon, and the minimum wage was one of those. The marijuana laws were also one of those, where they legalized it across the state, but then they allowed individual counties and cities to outlaw dispensaries, and so they gave some local control in that. That's the kind of coming together and working across the aisle that rural Oregonians would love to see. Our complaint is that we don't see that enough. Measure 110, there was no, that was a statewide ballot measure that was passed across the state. Every county in Eastern Oregon voted against it overwhelmingly, forced on the whole state. There was no provision for Eastern Oregon counties to say we don't want to have legalized hard drugs in our communities. Measure 114, same thing, passed statewide. Overwhelmingly, every county in Eastern Oregon said we don't want this law, voted overwhelmingly against it, and yet there was no provision for rural Oregonians. I think there are a lot of ways to solve the urban-rural divide and to get people government that makes sense for their communities. We have not seen enough of that, though. Those 2 examples you gave were great, but we haven't seen enough of that, and the frustration in rural Oregon is that it hasn't been enough. There has not been enough reaching across the aisle. There has not been enough working together. There has not been enough understanding of rural needs that are different than urban needs.
Can I thank you for the way you phrased the question and tying a big question to 2 very specific examples that I think points toward a spectrum of responses to what we've been talking about? And can I also just say thank you for the work you've done? So very much appreciated.
Hey, how's it going? I'm Tamara Hubbard, and I am, I guess, representing Black Portland here, but that's okay. It was really interesting hearing everyone talk from different perspective, and Alexander, you're blowing my mind with all the heady convos. It's really great. I guess a question that I have, also coming from a PK, is when we're talking about cultures, and you kept saying the culture in Eastern Oregon and Western Oregon, what are the cultures exactly? What do you mean by that? And also you mentioned policies, so and you just mentioned Measure 110 and 114, so maybe we can skip those 2. What are exactly the measures, or the policies and the cultures that are so different in Portland, or let's say Eastern and Western Oregon. Thank you.
Yeah. So
Thanks for the question.
if you take almost any issue that people vote on, I mean literally any issue, whether it's abortion or guns or taxes or minimum wage or immigration, the people in Eastern Oregon tend to vote one way, and that's opposite of the way that the people in Western Oregon vote. And these two groups, the two sides of the state, are fairly homogenous groups. The west side of the state, tends to vote 60-65% one way. The east side of the state votes 70-75% the other way. So when we talk about this different culture, it's really, we see things differently and want different things for our communities on almost every issue. So another example, we talked about Measure 110 and Measure 114, but when the pandemic hit 3 years ago in 2020, that was something that really supercharged our movement because what you had is you had this statewide response to the pandemic. And the statewide response, Oregon was a very heavy-handed, lots of lockdowns, schools locked down, kids in masks, mask requirements, vaccine requirements, all these things that were very kind of heavy-handed, directed by the government, forced upon the whole state. And I lived in both sides of the state when that happened. We started the pandemic on the west side of the state. We moved during the pandemic to the east side of the state. And I can tell you, when I got to the east side of the state, the people in the east side of the state did not want those restrictions. They did not, they didn't agree with them. They didn't want them for their communities. And it caused a massive amount of political tension and a massive amount of just tension in general. And so that was another example where our government chose not to recognize the differences between the east and the west side. Our government could have said, our state level government could have said, you know what, for these urban areas in the Willamette Valley, for people that want their schools to be shut, for people that want their kids to be in masks, we respect that, and we're gonna allow you to put those rules in place. But for those of you in Eastern Oregon who don't want your schools shut, you don't want your kids in masks, you want your churches open, we're going to respect that and allow you to make those rules yourself. That didn't happen during the pandemic. And so what ended up happening is we had these school board meetings in Eastern Oregon where we'd never seen numbers like this. 100 people would show up to a school board meeting and they would say, we don't want our kids in masks. We don't want our kids in masks. And it's just person after person after person. We want our kids in school and we don't want them in masks. And these school boards said, I'm sorry, our hands are tied. We know that the community doesn't want this. We know that the overwhelming majority of people over here don't want these policies. There's nothing we can do because the state was handing out fines to anybody that didn't go along with what the rules were. And it just caused massive, massive issues.
Thanks, Carina.
I'm just gonna straight up disagree and call out that I'm speaking for only myself and not trying to represent a whole region of the state. And I will say, as somebody who came from one of these counties where we had people from the Warm Springs community show up to our school board meeting for 509J in Madras and had a ton of anti-maskers shouting over our community members, it's not accurate to say the people of East Oregonian felt this or these sort of things. That's just not accurate. Jefferson County school is made up of 1/3 Mexican, 1/3 Native, 1/3 white, but we don't turn out in elections. And it's a lot because of this sort of narrative and this sort of conversation. And when you stand up and you say something, you have a target on your back. And I think, the pandemic, it did really put this divide in, but I think as a woman of color, it also really helped me identify who I am and am not safe around. Because it might not be necessarily that, being anti-mask means that you are racist and these sort of things, but it certainly aligns with these sort of areas. And there's these ways that we just need to be realistic with things. The people who wanted to be safe, who were being impacted by these health things that wanted these state policies to be carried out, were literally shouted over. And to not be able to acknowledge that there are connections in these things is ridiculous. And we'd have these conversations about, let's be realistic here. If we have people who can't care about our health and our safety and want to make this a political issue, could they speak up on this on our behalf? No. You think me and my friends have these conversations about, we don't want to talk about lynching. We don't want to talk about violence. We don't want to talk about these things that were very real for people of color in this state. But if I'm sitting in Madras and one of my peers who's white can't understand the concepts that I'm talking about and can't validate the very real experiences in my life, would I expect them to stop a lynching from happening 60 years ago? No. if we can't be realistic and cut through to what's really happening and keep having these conversations where things are not just laid out very clearly, we're never going to get anywhere. So I will say there were a lot of people in the community I'm from that is from rural Oregon that were just straight up plowed over. So I just wanted to make that clear.
This looks like a very quick follow-up.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I just wanted to also remind folks that, Alberta Street was once red line. So when talking about borders, let's remember that. I haven't heard that yet, so just wanted to bring it.
Thank you. Thanks.
I first want to just appreciate the dialogue tonight. We don't have enough conversations across lines of difference. I'm Leo Bialis White. I am a non-shroom consumer. I grew up in the state of Georgia, which the town I was in was actually Cherokee land originally. And 170 years ago, we actually had a skirmish about nationhood, you may remember. And I think my question to you all is, when should we consider the statehood as the unit of change or nationhood as the unit of change? I can imagine an argument around similar peoples giving state or nationhood back to Native American communities. And so I just would love to hear dialogue about the unit of change being statehood or nationhood.
Thanks, Leo. Alexander, that was a good intake of
That's
breath.
actually my academic specialty is nationalism. So
Okay.
and I've taught classes on nationalism and stuff. I'm actually very anti-national, but you have to understand the history of what the concept of nationalism came out of. It's a very recent concept. It came out, it evolved from specifically a man named Herder, who is a German romantic in 1790s. He wrote a book called The Origins of Language. And he was like saying, well, maybe we should start identifying not with our religion and our kings or nobility, but maybe we should start identifying with our language and culture. And then that spread throughout Europe in revolutionary ways. There was even something called Spring of Nations. When we apply the word nation to indigenous people, that's an artificial construct onto them. They never saw themselves based on language groups. They saw themselves based on tribal connections and relationship connections and stuff. I would really avoid, I just avoid nations itself. It's like, when I've had people say, well, Cascadia is going to be a new nation. It's like, no, not to swear, because I almost said something, the F word. It's not a nation. So the question goes back to, do we do it based on state or nation? I would, again, hesitate on nation. Because what is a nation? Let me give you another example. My own ancestry, I'm partially Croatian or Croat on my mother's side. And where my grandmother was born was a place called Dubrovnik. Dubrovnik used to be called Ragusa. Ragusa used to be its own empire at one time. It was a rival with Venice. And they used to speak Ragusan. That language doesn't exist anymore because all of a sudden now we're Croats, which is a brand new fictitious concept. We used to be Serbo-Croatians, or we used to be Yugoslavs. Then that got split up, and now the two languages are very different. Another really modern concept is the idea of Ukrainian versus Russian. They used to be very similar languages. Now you're hearing, Ukrainian is far closer to Bulgarian, or not Bulgarian, Macedonian and Polish. And it's like, when did this come about? And it's because people start doing what I call ethnic or linguistic cleansing. They start removing words that are, that's more associated with Russian, or that's more associated with Serbian. And so they start picking and choosing. So I avoid nations and stuff like that concept. Again, indigenous people, I would say that's indigenous nations, but that's a colonial, imposed concept onto them. So, yeah, anyway.
Thank you. Can I Carina, ask if you have a response to Leo's question about states, nations, that unit, which is the unit to focus on? If
Not a
either?
short one. So we'll just, I think, again, and we just have to go from where we're at and work out the issues we have, and we can't really shift those things yet. We just have to keep having these hard conversations, and it's hard because I really hate when people say find the middle ground, because for the people who are, the more traditionally oppressed ones, that means we have to always just turn the other cheek, turn the other cheek, turn the other cheek. That's what that means. So, but I don't think nationalism is the answer.
Is it okay if I go to, you gotta,
Well, I was just going to say, I think the goal is self-determination. The goal is that people know how they want to organize their communities the best. And so whatever makes sense to allow people, similar peoples and groups that self-identify, to be able to make their communities and the rules in the government for their communities that make sense, that's what we should encourage. In the case of Oregon, we've chosen to move a border for the state because in the case of Oregon, it's really pretty clear-cut. The east side is very different than the west side. It's geographically, there's a nice dividing line. It would make a lot of sense to just move that border at the state level. That may not be true in every state, however, and there might be other ways to get more self-determination for communities.
Can I add something?
sure.
And though I just advocate mushrooms, I've never taken mushrooms. I've studied them all my life. And I've
For
never
the
taken-
record.
You know what though?
Except for the kind you get in cans and stuff like that. But
Also, Alexander, the night is young. Renee, thank you.
In a former life, I was tall. Not this one. As an Indigenous woman, my name is Renee Romanos, Pivawana. Greetings, good day, everyone. I was born here in Oregon. I've lived on both sides of the mountain. I grew up on Mount Hood, near Mount Hood, and my undergrad is from Eastern Oregon University, and I lived over there for several years. I loved it. I don't see the point in destroying the relationships that we have as Oregonians. If you like Idaho, you're welcome to move there. My feeling as a person from this state is that we need to come together, not separate. We need to support our tribes. We need to honor the treaties. We need to honor each other. If you have a different way of living and believing, great. Let's have conversations about that. Let's find commonalities where we can improve our state rather than cut it down the middle. We don't even acknowledge Puerto Rico. People get stopped without a passport. They're like, you can't go, it's an international flight. No, Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. Yeah. Let's make that a state before we start cutting up other states. So that's my opinion, and I would like to know how you see us going forward as a state. Is it chop it down the middle? Because as Indigenous people, it's been chopped a lot. The Native people of Oregon have suffered tremendously by this chopping, by these creation of borders. We say the border crossed us. We didn't cross the borders. Right. And for my sister from Warm Springs, my hands go up to you for your courage, your strength, and I know you have to go the extra mile because I do it too. I've been told to go back to my own country. As Charlie Hill, the Native comedian, says, then I went and put a teepee up in their backyard. We shouldn't have to do that. Yes, we greet these things with humor because that's what gets us through as Indigenous people. But you and I, we need to understand this is our state. And if you're making a decision that affects you right now and your constituents, I'm sorry, I don't know if you're in office or not, but your neighbors right now, what's it going to do for the 7th generation? How is that going to benefit the planet? How is it going to benefit the 7th generation yet to come? In many Native communities, we make decisions for 7 generations ahead. This is not ours. We are entrusted with this land and these waters and these mountains and these resources from our great-great-great-great-grandchildren. We have a responsibility to them to get along, to find commonalities. How do you see us moving forward as a state to find those commonalities and build ourselves together as a state rather than tear us apart?
Yeah,
Thanks, Renee.
thank you for that comment, and there was a lot there. But moving the border is one solution. We have a problem in this state, and the problem is we have two very different cultures that are growing further apart, and it's an unequal relationship. One of those cultures has almost complete dominance over the other politically, and so that causes problems. That causes tension. That causes frustration. It's not an equal relationship, and so I've heard a lot of people say like, oh, well, political tension's good. Political tension might be good when you're in complete control, but when you have no control and you have no ability to organize your communities the way that makes sense, it doesn't feel very good. And so there's a lot of different ways that our state can move forward and recognize and give more voice and give more local control to Eastern Oregon communities. It just hasn't happened. This Greater Idaho came about because of that unequalness and that cultural divide, and it's a solution, and it's a solution that when we're asking voters in Eastern Oregon, 60% of the people that are voting in Eastern Oregon are saying, we want to pursue this. We see this as the solution that makes sense for our communities, and we need to respect that. These communities, these are people that know their communities better than anybody. They feel like they have no voice, they feel like they have no political power, and they see this as a solution that they want to move forward.
I don't know if Alexander or Carina, do you want to respond to Renee's question about moving forward? I see maybe one or two more questions before we get to
I guess I actually just want to ask another question, and that's what about all the people who live in these communities who don't believe in Greater Idaho? How are you advocating for them?
Yeah,
Matt, can we leave it as a question for now, or do you want to?
Well, leave it.
Okay. I mean, I want to make sure that the three of you are, that this doesn't become that we're just.
We can talk
about
afterwards, Karina.
Yeah.
Maybe
I want everyone to hear the answer.
Okay. Well, if it makes sense to try to respond to that, will you ask it one more time then?
Well, I mean, because I think that's the real question: is you're speaking about the group of people like you're representing everyone, but you're not. And so,
Sure.
if this isn't to be cut up, how are you advocating and representing people?
So you're never going to have 100% agreement on anything or in any place or anybody in any community, but you do have kind of an not overwhelming, but a strong majority of similar thought. And so, right now, Eastern Oregon is forced into a relationship with Western Oregon that they don't want to be in, and doesn't make sense for their communities. They have their own community. Eastern Oregon is its own culture. It is its own community. And no, not everybody agrees, but the vast majority of people in Eastern Oregon want the same things. They want similar government. They want similar things for their communities. And we should respect that and try to advocate for them being able to get that.
Well, and I guess my last question, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to ask it. Do you really think that people who are advocating for Greater Idaho are the most disenfranchised people in these communities?
I'm not sure quite how to answer that. I know that when we put this to a vote, 60% of people on average are voting for our measures. They want their elected leaders to look into this, and I'm not sure who those people are, but a strong majority of people in Eastern Oregon do want this to move forward.
Which
But
feels
is
like
the answer yes or no?
feels
Are
like
they
a
the most
different question.
disenfranchised?
I have
community?
no idea. I don't know
Well, that
who
was
votes.
It's good.
just to help people think.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think one thing we keep going back to is this question. I feel like there might be a spectrum between seeing Oregon as comprised of two cultures and Oregon as comprised of many, many cultures. And it seems to me that a lot of the difference in what we're talking about is coming back to that. So I just want to name something that I'm observing while I'm up here. I think we have one more question, and then we're going to wrap up the formal part, and the real good conversation will start.
Hi there, I'm Rayleigh, and I was just curious, why does Greater Idaho want to specifically split like Oregon and Idaho the way that it does? I mean, I grew up in western rural Oregon, which is politically very the same as Eastern Oregon. So why is that not included? Like, why are the majority of Oregon, rural Oregon especially, is very politically Eastern Oregon. They have the same ideas and politics. So why is it that split? Where's like the reasoning?
Yeah, great question. So when this movement started, and I wasn't part of the movement at that point, but when the movement started, they looked at the way people voted, and they said it would make more sense for these counties that vote consistently this way to get state-level government from this state that has that kind of government. And so the original proposal included all of Eastern Oregon essentially and all of Southern Oregon. And so there's maps floating around, you'll see them, because you're right, Southern Oregon, rural Oregon votes very conservatively. But our movement's about self-determination, and we made a decision early on to go directly to voters and ask them. And instead of doing something to voters, go to voters and say, do you want your elected leaders to look into doing this? And so we've gone to a vote in 12 Eastern Oregon counties, and we've won all 12, assuming that our Wallowa County vote that's going on right now stays in our favor. We're winning currently, but the election's not finalized. But we've also gone to a vote in 2 Southern Oregon counties, and we lost both of those votes. The people of Southern Oregon, though they tend to vote very conservatively and have their own kind of unique way of looking at life, they were not interested in pursuing being part of Idaho. And so our movement, when we lost those votes, we redrew the border. That's the beauty of a border, and it's an imaginary line. You can put it wherever it makes sense to put it. If the people of Southern Oregon don't want to be part of Idaho, we're certainly not going to try to force them to come along. We're trying to match people to government that they want and that matches their values, not create more problems by where we put it.
And maybe it's worth saying, just for clarity's sake, that the vote that's being taken in these counties is to explore the idea.
It's to have elected leaders explore the idea.
So,
right?
and that
Yeah.
for what seems like an ongoing period of time, it's basically to talk about it within the counties that vote for it, and then that's still quite far from anything like passage, which takes multiple steps from multiple states and the federal government. So just what a vote for means is a vote for exploring right now. I want to make sure that we're respecting everybody's time, and so Alexander, it looked like maybe you had a thought, and then we'll go to Carina.
I was just going to ask, what would happen if you had Greater Idaho and everybody decided we just don't like Boise anymore? Would you kick Boise out?
Well, so I actually hear that question a lot. And again, you're always going to have a minority within a majority. And there's no way to avoid it. You never have 100% agreement on anything in life. Where it makes sense to match people to government that they want, we should try to do that. You know, Eastern Oregon, as I mentioned, part of the reason why this movement makes sense is because Eastern Oregon borders a state that is very similar to them in almost every way. And so it would make sense to move that border and get them that government. In a case like Boise, it would be landlocked. Right. You'd have to find other ways to try to get those people the self-determination that we want to get people.
Part of the reason why I brought that up is because there was a senator in Idaho, which was Frank Church, who was pretty much, we would count as left. I mean, again, limited American left. He was very much against, sending water down to California and stuff like that, very much an environmentalist. So it shows you that Idaho isn't this monolithic idea either. Plus, that, again, political structures or political ideologies changes all the time. Again, we used to have 2 Republican governors who were pretty much what we count left today.
And I should just say that I know there are people from Idaho that have been watching this tonight.
Hi, people.
And I think curious about the shape of the conversation in their state and the effect on their state. And the people that I know in Idaho who are weighing in come from a range of perspectives, a wide range. So I just want to put that out again with this question of 2 or many. I want to go to Carina. If there's anything in your head you want to leave us with before.
Can I go last?
That's what I'm asking. You got last word here.
Oh, no, you go ahead.
I think we're already.
Oh, this is it.
Over.
This is the last word.
You got it. What do you want to say?
I mean, I think that we all really came here to talk about things that we're passionate about, but at the end, it was just to have this conversation, and I hope that people can really feel how painful and how beautiful my life has been, and maybe heard some of the things about some of the work that we're doing, and learned a little bit about, the kind of stuff that tribes are dealing with and that people are dealing with, and just can think about some of these things in a different way. So I think, borders they're in place, and I think it's important. I'm actually very appreciative to have shared the stage with these folks. It was probably not something I would have organized, but again, I come from a conservative place, and I have to go into rooms where people don't think I belong there and don't think that I should have the kind of rights I do, and I have to work with them, and I have to work with policy that is going to be harmful to our people for a long time. So I think, again, we got to hold on to each other and work it out. So
thank you. In the spirit both of going into rooms and working it out, and who organizes these events, I just want to say, like, the organization I'm with tries to get people talking about challenging questions. And sometimes we do it where there are people on a stage with lights, but more often it's actually where we sit in circles and everybody's talking. And so I would encourage people that find that mode interesting to check out some of the conversation projects happening around the state. We train people to lead challenging conversations, and so we're very much interested in this idea of holding on to each other and working it out. I want to thank you, all three of you, again, for really committing to this and talking with each other and with all of us, and I want to thank all of you for sticking with this and being so present for the evening. Let's formally call it good, and let's keep talking to the extent that you feel comfortable informally. Thank you very much.